Why not go out on a limb? That is where the fruit is. Mark Twain. Today, I am looking at a video of a conversation between Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro. I'm going out on a limb here because Peterson is discussing the psychology of treating transgender people. As a clinical psychologist, Peterson is in his field and speaking from a position of strength. But his discussion with Shapiro is in response to a change in Canada law, Bill C-4, banning conversion therapy. And the legal area is my bailiwick. Peterson rose to fame when C-16 was passed in 2017, and his position claiming that the bill impeded his ability to treat patients, as it would require him to use certain pronouns with certain patients, was immensely popular with conservatives. He was wrong. C-16 never required him to say anything. Now, Canada has passed Bill C-4, prohibiting conversion therapy. Peterson once again claims the legislature is impeding his ability to practice his trade as it requires him to affirm a person's gender identity. But once again, Peterson misses the mark on the legal ramifications. But did I go too far afield into the realm of psychology, and am I in danger of falling out of the tree entirely? Or am I the one that will end up with the fruit in this discussion? Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. I have a patron announcement to make. Thomas Penny has become a patron at the $20 level. He is the first. I need to make a new category for him. Watch the credits at the end to see what I come up with. As I'm recording this, I haven't even decided yet. Today, we are looking at Jordan Peterson talking about Canada Bill C-4, which was passed on December 8th and goes into effect on January 8th, 4 days from now as I am recording this. Oh, Ben Shapiro is there too, but I think his real function in the video is to set up Peterson's points and to be a pretty face. That's about all Ben Shapiro is good for anyway. He has a couple of points that we will discuss, but the main focus will be on Peterson.
People are, what would you say, doomed to their own autonomy. But I'm not saying words that other people want me to say. And the idea of compelled speech, it's like the bill was this much about gender.
Right.
And it was this much about, right. Oh yeah, the government's going to tell me what to say, hey.
Here Peterson is specifically addressing Bill C-16. They will get to C-4 later. Many have pointed out that Canada Bill C-16, which is an anti-discrimination law, does not require anyone to say anything. Thus, it isn't forced speech, as Peterson and Shapiro claim here. Here is the actual bill. Fear not, I won't read it. But here is the entire bill. So Peterson's characterization of the bill being this much about gender is a gross mischaracterization, as the bill isn't even that long in its entirety. Maybe Peterson is looking at a large print version because of age? Peterson is a year younger than me. If you need that large a print, Jordan, maybe get a pair of reading glasses like me? They only cost about $5. Then maybe you wouldn't need a copy of the bill that only has one letter to a page. There is nothing in the bill that says that you must say anything. It doesn't say that you must use particular pronouns. All it says is that you can't discriminate. It does add gender identity to the list of protected classes against one can't express hate speech. Nowhere does the bill define misgendering a person as hate speech. This is an interpretation that some have taken from the bill. However, according to Brenda Kosman, law professor at the University of Toronto and director of the Mark S. Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies, the misuse of gender pronouns without more cannot rise to the level of a crime. It cannot rise to the level of advocating genocide, inciting hatred, hate speech, or hate crimes. It simply cannot meet the threshold. Would it cover a situation where an individual repeatedly, consistently refuses to use a person's chosen pronoun? It might. If someone refused to use a preferred pronoun and it was determined to constitute discrimination or harassment, the act does not direct anyone to use a particular pronoun or to say anything. It prohibits discrimination and harassment. If you are using pronouns in a way that you are discriminating against someone or harassing them, then you are engaging in prohibited speech. But the law doesn't direct you to use any pronouns at all. Think of it this way. Because the term boy was used as a form of harassment against black males, it is not acceptable speech. The word boy is not prohibited. It is only prohibited to use the word to harass someone based on race. No law requires you to refer to a black man as a man. You just aren't allowed to harass him by using an offensive term. Here is where I get confused as to the intent of Christians. If being a Christ follower means showing love to one another, wouldn't not using an offensive term to refer to your neighbor be just as obvious? I'm sure Peterson doesn't want people using derogatory terms that he finds offensive about him. So wouldn't do unto others not demand that you not use derogatory terms against other people? The mandate shouldn't even need to come from the government for a Christian. It should come from the very Bible that you claim to believe. I realize that Peterson's belief system is complicated, but he does claim the moniker Christian. This issue was partially responsible for fracturing my faith. Peterson isn't alone in being critical about political correctness. Shapiro echoes his thoughts.
I'm on the same page with you.
As do countless other Christians who don't want to be told to be politically correct. As a believer, I wondered how we could possibly share the gospel with someone when we continually offend them with the way we address them. If I want to convince someone that my God loves them and wants them to accept him, but I use an offensive term to refer to that person, how can they possibly hear my message? All they're going to hear is my offensive speech. Christians who want to convert others to Christianity, instead of complaining about political correctness, should be the first in line to find out what terms are preferred by their target audience. The same should hold true for therapists. How can you effectively listen to and communicate with a patient when you are using a gender pronoun for them that you know is offensive to them? If you feel the need to misgender a patient, then maybe you shouldn't be that patient's therapist.
To me, the fact that what you're trying to force me to say is so innately opposed to the good is the problem.
I would like to know why Shapiro thinks that accepting a person's gender identity is innately opposed to the good. I realize that he doesn't accept transgender people for who they are. He insists that they must be who he dictates that they are. But how does this translate to using preferred pronouns as innately opposed to the good? If Shapiro has appointed himself the arbiter of gender, by what authority has he done so? Or has he promoted himself to God? If Shapiro doesn't think he is God, where are the scientific studies that are showing that accepting a person's gender is innately opposed to their well-being?
But the level of passion that I have for issues like this one really go to the fact that I think the fundamental good of humanity relies on basic acknowledgments of biological truth, especially when it comes to gender.
So Shapiro thinks that the fundamental good of humanity depends on people agreeing with him that gender is determined by what he deems biological truths. But what biological truths are these? Is anatomy the determining factor in the biological truth of one's gender? Anatomy is not always in alignment with chromosomes. Are chromosomes the biological factor? XX and XY are not the only biological possibilities. What gender is a person who is XXY or XYY? But what I really want to know...
Will Princess Caroline's pregnancy save her shaky marriage? Inquiring minds want to know.
I want to know.
How is this going to be the downfall of all of humanity? Biology tells us that brain function is different in males and females, and that tests show transgender people are the gender they say they are by brain function. Is brain function the biological truth that determines gender? If so, we need to listen to the transgender people as they know better about their own biological truths than outward appearance would tell us. Here's renegade science teacher Forrest Valkai with a few details on this. A link to his full video is in the description, and trust me, it is cool, informative, and well-researched. If you want more information on how biology supports the transgender community, give it a view.
The truth is that masculine and feminine really don't mean anything in concrete terms, certainly not in biological terms. There are, in fact, small structural differences between the brains of male and female humans. They're quite subtle. We're talking about clusters of neurons that are like the size of a grain of rice. These are differences that develop within a few weeks before birth to maybe a couple of years after birth. The major notable brain regions that are usually talked about in research papers on this type of thing are the sexually dimorphic nucleus of the preoptic area, the central subdivision of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, and the vasoactive intestinal polypeptide-containing subnucleus of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Yeah, try saying that 3 times fast. And here's a fun fact for you. Trans people have been consistently shown to have neural architecture in these areas that matches their gender identity, not their genitalia.
And then you have kids and you realize that there's a pool in which we are all swimming. And that pool is going to define...
Virginia.
Exactly. Like my kid, it's going to determine how my kid lives. And I want my community to reflect some of my values because I don't want my kid to live in the toxic sludge that you are creating for my kid. I don't want you indoctrinating my kids in bullshit about whether...
And there you have it. Shapiro is intolerant of anyone that opposes his viewpoint because he wants his kids to grow up in a community where everyone thinks like he does. He wants his kids raised in an environment where it's his way or no way. I guess he really has promoted himself to God. There was another group that tried to do that. It was a dismal failure. It was the Puritans. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was formed as a Puritan colony where you had to be a Puritan to live there. Anyone who disagreed with Puritan theology was banished. But children have a tendency to think for themselves as they grow up and not always agree with their parents' ideas. It became painfully obvious that trying to make sure your children think like you do cannot be achieved by limiting the ideas that they hear to only the ones that you agree with. Not only that, exposure to other ideas is how we learn and grow. So what you call toxic sludge may be just what your child needs to determine what is or isn't a good idea. What you are proposing is that you want to raise your children in an echo chamber.
It's certainly the case that 1 out of 10 women, now it depends on where you put the cutoff point, say, but you could say with reasonable certainty that 1 in 10 women has a masculine temperament and 1 in 10 men has a feminine temperament. And so that's a lot of people. And those people, especially if they're also creative, well, they're kind of at a loss in relationship to what to do with their identity because they're pulled, first of all, they have a hard time catalyzing their identity. Creative people have a hard time catalyzing it. It's like the definition of creativity. They're protean. And so there have been people who play at the edges of gender identity forever. And fair enough. And sometimes that's even admirable if it's done in a sophisticated way. And it's charismatic. So you see it in Mick Jagger, you see it in David Bowie, you see it, and you see it in people like Madonna as well, because Madonna had a hard edge, that was very masculine. And all the Marvel superhero women have a hard masculine edge. And so we find that charismatic because those people are also integrative. But the notion that there's such a thing as gender, that's not right. There's variability in personality and temperament.
So Peterson accepts that gender is fluid, at least in some people. He has also introduced another factor, temperament. There is a biological genetic component to temperament. If 10% of women have what you call male temperament, and the same for men, how can you then say that biology determines your gender? What part of biology? If temperament, then being transgender is completely consistent with biology.
That
Agreed.
there's no such thing as biological sex. That's just
insanity.
insane.
It's insanity. They've abstracted gender from sex and then read gender back into sex as more important than sex. It's completely...
Well, and then why insist upon the biological modifications?
Right.
If there's no such thing as sex, it's like, well, then just act out your role.
Right.
Who says there's no such thing as sex? That's the whole reason for separating gender from sex, because sex is real. And why not just act out your role? It's possible that given the opportunity that this would be a plausible solution. I'm not certain on this one. It's impossible to tell, given the state of the world that we live in. But if there was no discrimination against being transgender, if everyone who was accepted for who they are as they say they are, and was permitted to act out the role that they identify with, would gender dysphoria vanish on its own? It's impossible to say. Since we don't live in this world, we can't know what it would be like to do so. Certainly, it is true that people like Jordan and Ben make life far more difficult for the transgender community by claiming that they don't exist, that they are pretending, that they are going through a phase, or that their feelings are sinful. Gender dysphoria is real. Depression and suicidal thoughts are far more prevalent in people with dysphoria than in the general population. However, of those that are supported in their chosen gender, depression and suicidal ideation is far less prevalent, to the point of being about the same as the general population. If we could get rid of the stigma against expressing gender in any way we want, would gender dysphoria cease to exist, as anyone would be free to express gender in any way they desire, and anatomy would no longer dictate their gender roles? It's hard to say. There likely would be some that would still want the anatomy to agree with their self-perception, but I predict that it would be far fewer. The number of people who identify as transgender is rising, primarily because the stigma is starting to disappear. The acceptance of being transgender is on the rise, with laws like C-16 and C-4 making life more equitable for the trans community. It's possible, and even likely, Jordan and Ben, that the very fact that you sit there and complain about these new laws is the very fact that proves the need for the laws. Your complaints might be what drive the need to alter the body to match the mind, so that gender expression in a way that is socially accepted to you and others like you is even possible. I don't speak for the transgender community, and I have never experienced gender dysphoria. I'm sure that even if socially accepted, there would still be some that would want to surgically transition, as being in a body that doesn't fit your body image is problematic, and can be to the point where it is a health issue. But being accepted for who you are would go a long way in making everyone more comfortable, despite the body image issues.
Leave your body alone because it's irrelevant anyways. Well, it turns out it's not irrelevant. You have to go through the surgical transformation.
The transgender community doesn't push surgical transformation. Within the community, it is acceptable to transition in whatever way you desire and are comfortable with. Do you want a social transition? That is acceptable. Do you want hormones? That is acceptable. Do you want surgery? That is also acceptable. Do you know who is pushing the transgender community to surgery? Legislatures and politicians. For example, in Montana, if you want to change your sex on your birth certificate, you must transition surgically. So if you want to make the claim that surgery isn't necessary, then back your claim by making the transition without surgery easier.
So now in Canada, because they banned conversion therapy, it's now all affirmation therapy.
Right.
There's no such thing as affirmation therapy.
Peterson and Shapiro have obviously switched from talking about C-16 to talking about C-4, though they never mention the shift. C-4 is the bill that banned conversion therapy. Peterson's comments don't apply to C-16, so we will turn our attention now to C-4. Let's look at what the law really says. The preamble explains the intent of the bill and is of interest. Whereas conversion therapy causes harm to society, because, among other things, it is based on and propagates myths and stereotypes about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, including the myth that heterosexuality, cisgender gender identity, and gender expression that conform to the sex assigned to a person at birth are to be preferred over other sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions. And whereas, in light of those harms, it is important to discourage and denounce the provision of conversion therapy in order to protect the human dignity and equality of all Canadians. Does Peterson disagree with this goal? He never says one way or the other. Next, the bill makes several changes to the criminal code, amending laws on child pornography, making it illegal to make, possess, or distribute advertisements for conversion therapy services. Next, the bill defines conversion therapy as service designed to change a person's sexual orientation to heterosexual, change a person's gender identity to cisgender, change a person's gender expression so it conforms to the sex assigned to the person at birth, repress or reduce non-heterosexual attraction or sexual behavior, repress a person's non-cisgender gender identity, or repress or reduce a person's gender expression that does not conform to the sex assigned to the person at birth. The Act excludes from the definition a practice, treatment, or service that relates to the exploration or development of an integrated personal identity, such as a practice, treatment, or service that relates to a person's gender transition and that is not based on an assumption that a particular sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression is to be preferred over another. This is the rest of the bill. That is the bill in its entirety. Nowhere does it say anything about affirming therapy. Peterson claims that the bill requires affirmation therapy, which he says doesn't exist, yet the bill requires nothing of a therapist. It merely prohibits a therapist from telling a patient that one gender expression or identity or sexual orientation is preferable to another. So once again, Peterson's complaints are unfounded, as the bill does not do what he claims. I have to wonder if Shapiro knows this and is trying hard to find a way to play along with Peterson's claims, or if he's unfamiliar with the content of the bill, as he gets a bit tongue-tied here.
Therapy.
Right. No, it's insane. I mean,
It's insane is his best response. What is? Allowing people to identify as they wish? Not forcing people to change their identity or sexual orientation because it doesn't agree with your ideas of what it should be? Why are you the decider of who people are and who they are permitted to be sexually attracted to?
I had a 14-year-old kid who was a client of mine, and he was in the mid stages of puberty. He was a pretty creative kid, agreeable kid as well, right? And that's important. So he had a bit of a feminine temperament. That also meant he could be pushed around fairly easily. Well, there was an aggressively gay guy in his school, was hitting on him and trying to convince him that he was gay. Well, he didn't know, so he wanted to talk to me about it. It's like, well, I was going to tell him. What the hell do I know about this kid?
Exactly.
And I wanted to hear what his problems were and how it might be sorted out, what he wanted. And like that's what you do in therapy, is you help people sort out their problems. Now this idea is you come to me with an axiomatic claim, whatever it is about your identity, and my job is to rubber stamp it. It's like, I'm not a therapist then.
Shapiro made a comment about how electric shock in conversion therapy shouldn't be confused with... I would like to have addressed it, but Peterson jumped in with this point and Ben never got to finish the thought. Peterson has a lot to say here, which I want to keep in context. Let's start with the statement that women are pushed around fairly easily. What he actually said was people with a feminine temperament are pushed around fairly easily, but Peterson clearly thinks this to be a feminine trait. There is some truth to that, but is the fact that females are less aggressive a product of biology or of environment? This study indicates that we don't know. We do know that as it is becoming more socially acceptable for women to assert their own rights, they are doing so. So what Peterson believes to be sex-linked traits may not be so. It could be more role-linked traits that will even out as it becomes more socially acceptable to exhibit the traits you desire instead of the ones demanded of you by people like Peterson and Shapiro, that sex roles are whatever they say they are. Next, what Peterson describes his son going through is wrong. It is sexual harassment, and had it occurred in a therapy session, it would have been included in the bill's definition of conversion therapy, as the aggressor was trying to change or challenge Peterson's son's sexual orientation. I find it ironic that Peterson is complaining about a bill restricting his ability to practice psychology, and the example that he comes up with to set up why the bill is problematic includes exactly the kind of behavior the bill seeks to prohibit. If you don't want an aggressive male telling your son that he should be homosexual, can you not see that it is equally or even more problematic for an aggressive therapist to tell your son either that he should or should not have a homosexual orientation? Or that it is just as problematic for a therapist to insist you are transgender if you are not, as to insist that you are cisgender if you are not. Your very example points out why the law is needed. Then you complain about the law going too far for doing what the law doesn't even do. You claim that the law requires you to rubber stamp any claim a patient comes to you with. It does nothing of the sort. Nowhere in the law does it say anything about you making any kind of statement or affirmation to your patient. It merely prohibits you from imposing your ideas about sexual orientation and gender on your patient. It allows your patient to fully explain their problem, knowing that you won't criticize them for having the problem, or telling them that they don't have a problem, or that they just need to accept that they are who you say that they are. Wouldn't even you, Jordan Peterson, agree that this makes for a better therapy session if the patient knows that they can discuss their problem, knowing that you aren't going to impose your judgment on them? Your role as a therapist is to, as you said, help the patient sort out the issues. It isn't to impose your ideas and judgments on the patient. If you, as a therapist, cannot practice therapy without being allowed to impose your ideas and judgments on your patients, then maybe you are in the wrong line of work. Maybe you should be a preacher, as imposing views and judgments is what they do best.
I'm not a therapist then, so this is not only insane, this insistence. Like, I like to think of truth, untruth, and anti-truth, right? And the notion that therapists affirm is an anti-truth. Because, look, let's say you come to me and you say, you have a proposition about yourself, and I say, no, I'm your therapist. No, that's wrong. It's like, that's not good therapy.
Interesting. So even you recognize that if a patient comes to you and says that they are a woman in a man's body, that you, as a therapist, saying, no, you are wrong, is not good therapy. Yet this is exactly what the bill prohibits a therapist from telling a patient, that they are wrong about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Since you agree that this is bad therapy, why do you complain that the bill hampers your ability to practice your trade? Is this an admission that you are a bad therapist?
But neither is you have a proposition about yourself and you're disturbed enough to come to a therapeutic session, and I say, yes, you're right. It's like, I don't know if you're right.
Good. You recognize that you don't know a person's gender identity unless you ask them. You don't know if they are right or wrong, and as a therapist, determining the rightness or wrongness of a patient's ideas is not your job. Your job is to help them live with their issues, or if they want to change, help facilitate the change. There is nothing in C4 that impedes you from doing this in any way.
And if you're so right, why are you here? Like, what are we talking about if you're already right?
How about that other people around them refuse to accept them for who they are? Maybe parents refuse to allow them to dress or express their gender as they desire. Maybe their parents brought the patient to you and asked you to change the patient's way of thinking to match theirs. If conversion therapy was not banned by this bill, legally, you could do that.
Every single school of psychotherapy is predicated on the idea that free expression of thought, or the free transmutation of behavior, is curative.
Behavior is curative, but identity and orientation are not. Gender identity is not a behavior. Sexual orientation is not a behavior. The rest of the video moves on to another topic, so I will stop here. I want to give a shout out to Robin, who asked me to respond to this video. I was a bit intimidated to take on someone like Peterson, particularly when he's talking about his own field. However, here he tries to make it look like he's talking about psychology by couching his remarks in terms of his own practice and experiences as a therapist. However, his entire problem is a legal problem, a problem with how he feels C4 is going to impact his practice. But if he is a good therapist, he need not worry, as the law doesn't require him as a therapist to do or say anything, as he claims here. Rather, it prohibits him as a therapist from imposing his ideas about what is acceptable gender expression and sexual orientation on a patient, which, by his own admission, is what a good therapist should be refraining from doing in the first place. I think I got the fruit here. It is sinfully delicious. Live your life.